here. Before we begin, just a quick administrative note that in case of any emergency, please do turn to me for instructions as to what you should do. I am very, very happy to welcome you to this event. We are launching a number of reports, part of a broader series, Eurasia Inside Out, Eurasia Outside In, but this specifically looks at the Caucasus, and we wanted to kind of generate a little bit of attention by having a conversation about the issues that relate to this always dynamic region, and to not just focus on the folks who were involved in these reports, but also others who can provide perspectives. And I also am very hopeful. I can see a number of folks in the audience who are also very knowledgeable about the region, and I'm hoping that that means we'll have a particularly lively discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, then ask each of them to speak, following which we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A and discussion. So just going down the line here, Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff is my colleague here at CSIS. He's the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Program, and the author of Russian Foreign Policy, The Return of Great Power Politics. Next to him is Ambassador Kenneth Yalowitz, who was a U.S. Foreign Service officer for many years, and in that capacity served as ambassador both to Belarus and, importantly for our discussion today, to Georgia. He's also served in Moscow, The Hague, and the U.S. mission to NATO. Next to Ambassador Yalowitz is Ariel Cohen. Ariel is a specialist on energy, rule of law, a variety of other issues related to Russia and Eurasia. He is the founder and director of the Center for Energy, Natural Resources, and Geopolitics, as well as a senior fellow at the Institute for Analysis of Global Security. And then finally, Andrew Hutchins. Andy is a senior fellow at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown University. And he is my predecessor here as director of the CSIS Russia and Eurasia program, where he is now. We're happy to continue to maintain an affiliation with him as a senior non-resident associate, but he's also one of the folks who was very deeply involved in making this whole set of reports happen. So I don't know if all of you have a preferred order. My inclination is just to go down the line and start with Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Olya. I think it would maybe be most productive for me to talk a little bit about the project and some of the key findings, and then we can let the other panelists dive into the specific issues affecting the region more generally and each of the individual countries specifically. As Olya mentioned, this report series, and there are copies of the reports outside that I hope you'll grab on the way out if you didn't already, are country studies focusing on the foreign economic and security perspectives of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. About a year and a half ago, we did a similar series on the states of Central Asia. This is part of a larger project that we called, at least informally, Eurasia from the Inside Out, designed to give policymakers in Washington, but Americans and others more broadly, a perspective on the key economic and security issues in the region from the perspective of the countries themselves. We often in this town talk about the post-Soviet space or Central Asia and the Caucasus as objects of American foreign policy. And what we were trying to do with this report series was give them back subjectivity, to do a deep dive into the perspectives of elites in each of these countries, how they see their foreign economic and security environment. And on the basis of the interviews that we conducted, we wrote this series of reports focusing on each of the countries in the region. At the same time, we tried to draw broader conclusions about regional dynamics and to provide recommendations for U.S. policy on the basis of the findings. There's a fourth report in this series, which is kind of a summary and set of policy recommendations that is now available on our website, but we didn't have the printed copies available yet. We will. You know how publishing goes. But I want to talk a little bit about what is contained in those reports. You'll see from the title that these are called Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia in a Reconnecting Eurasia. Right, there's all of this talk, and there has been for several years, about the reconnection of Eurasia, the development of new infrastructure, transit, and trade connections throughout this vast landmass between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Now, of course, the Caucasus is one arena in which this reconnection is taking place. But at the same time, compared to other parts of Eurasia, the Caucasus continues to suffer from significant geopolitical fragmentation based on conflicts between states in the South Caucasus itself, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between states in the Caucasus and external actors, between Georgia and Russia, and on the basis of the competing regional ambitions of surrounding powers themselves. So connectivity in the South Caucasus has been limited, it's been partial, and it has not been as extensive perhaps as in other parts of the region. And instead, what you've seen is the emergence of ad hoc partnerships, for example, between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, initially on the basis of deepening connectivity, but then taking on more political and security cooperation as well. And at the same time, different forms of cooperation between Armenia and Russia, along with Iran. And so almost the emergence of an east-west connectivity axis as well as a north-south connectivity axis. But very little that's happening between these three countries at a regional level. That said, creates dilemmas for U.S. foreign policy. And here I want to talk just a little bit about the recommendations that are contained in the summary report, which you can find on our website. Given the difficulties of operating regionally, one of the key findings that we took away from this project was the importance of having productive bilateral ties with each of the South Caucasus states and trying to deepen those ties to the extent possible. The U.S. is far away, but at the same time, all of the states in the region and the people that we talked with during the field research for these reports expressed an interest in having deeper U.S. engagement. Of course, that desire for deeper engagement goes against the trend of a kind of U.S. retrenchment that we're seeing very much in the context of the current presidential debates. But nonetheless, that desire was there, and in the fluid geopolitical environment of the Caucasus is something that can help provide countries that are worried about being overawed by their neighbors a certain degree of balance. One challenge for the United States is ensuring that such engagement remains balanced among the three players, and especially on the Armenia-Azerbaijan front, doesn't tilt the balance in one way or another. At the same time, Georgia, because of its progress towards economic and political reform and its commitment to integration with the Euro-Atlantic world, should be a particular priority. Now, the most dangerous flashpoint in the South Caucasus remains the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Here, the United States has been involved in the OSCE's Minsk group, along with Russia and France, the other co-chairs, seeking to, if not resolve, then at least manage the conflict. Given the outbreak of significant violence this spring over Nagorno-Karabakh, you can see that efforts to limit and contain this conflict have not been met with overwhelming success. For that reason, we argue that the U.S. should increase its efforts to, at the very least, ameliorate the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is a very tall order given the level of mistrust between the participants and the domestic dynamics in both Yerevan and Baku. Nevertheless, given the consequences of a resumption of violence, this is an area that should be a high priority. Third, we focus on trying to reinvigorate regional connectivity and reducing the costs of transport. Given the existence of connections and infrastructure between Azerbaijan and Georgia and then on to Turkey, this is obviously the first area to focus. Energy is an important component and one that has larger strategic significance for Europe. However, given global changes in the energy market and the potential that oil and gas from the Caspian will be less important to the long-term energy security of Europe, greater effort should be placed on projects outside the energy sector as well. Fourth, the U.S. should work with its partners, particularly in the European Union, to promote political and economic reform and liberalization. This would be advantageous for all of the countries in the region. Again, Georgia is in some ways in a special category given the progress that it's made on these issues already, and should be the area of first priority. Nevertheless, efforts should also be made to along similar lines with Armenia and Azerbaijan, even though doing so may be a tall order given where domestic politics in these countries are. The U.S. has limited influence and limited leverage, which is part of the reason that working closely with the European Union is so important. The EU can offer the carrot of market access and visa liberalization to its partners in the South Caucasus as a carrot for encouraging political and economic reform. And finally, let me just say a word about Russia, which in some ways looms over all discussions of American policy in the post-Soviet space. Despite the fact that the U.S.-Russian relationship is at perhaps its lowest point since the Cold War, the Caucasus remains an area of both competition and cooperation between Washington and Moscow. Certainly over Georgia, it's an area of deep disagreement and competition. In the context of Nagorno-Karabakh, the U.S. and Russia continue to cooperate closely in the OSCE's Minsk group and have a shared interest in preventing a resumption of conflict, even if their preferred outcomes for the negotiating process don't coincide. Regardless, it's important not to see the South Caucasus as a chessboard, as an arena for geopolitical competition between the United States and Russia. Given Russia's greater geographic proximity and the number of levers that it maintains in all three of the South Caucasus countries, such a competition is one that the United States is not well placed to win, and one that is likely to exacerbate problems with Russia in other areas as well. So keeping in mind that Russia is a source of significant economic, political, cultural, and other kinds of influence in the region, nevertheless, the United States should be open to looking for areas where zero-sum competition is not the order of the day, and being open to cooperation, especially on issues such as addressing the potential for an upsurge of violence over Nagorno-Karabakh, even as it seeks to promote its own interests in the region, which may or may not coincide with the self-defined interests of Russia. So I'll stop there, and we can discuss more during the Q&A.
Thank you, Jeff. Ambassador?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to congratulate Jeff, Andrew, and Oliver. I think these three studies are terrific, and I just really think this is an excellent project. And I just wanted to, to congratulate you. I'm going to have a number of general comments and then some specific ones. You've already covered, a good number of the things that I was going to raise, but I think we need to keep in mind that, that the South Caucasus probably is declining in terms of overall U.S. interests. When I think of, Syria, I think of the whole panoply of issues, facing the United States. I think that, that's a realistic thing that we're going to have to, take a look at. And the other factors I think that contribute to this, Iran, the nuclear arrangement with Iran clearly, has the potential to move, the chess pieces, on the chessboard in that area. And I think, though, that, that Azerbaijan probably had a very special role and niche that it was carving out. in the event of hostilities, in Iran. And I think, that is another factor that they're going to have to take into account. The Northern Distribution Network, involving supplies for Afghanistan, that also, well, we seem to be going back little by little, but in the area, but that's another area as well. That sort of bespeaks to the fact that, that the area may be declining, somewhat in terms of priorities. You also mentioned energy. And, it's quite clear that Azerbaijani oil, as you mentioned in the study, their production is plateauing and probably going to decrease. And one of the things that I think, Azerbaijan is going to have to face, the question is whether or not gas exports, can make up the difference, and I'm not sure that they can. The Russians and the Turks have just resuscitated the Turkish Stream project again, and that may well, be a competitor to some of the other projects that are going on. So, as I say, I think when we look at this region, I think we just have to keep in mind, that its overall standing, may be, changing a bit. On the Silk Road prospects, I think in all the reports, there was a lot of very positive, estimates on the prospects, for the new Silk Road. Based on my own experience and also just from, reading that I've done, I think I would just throw up a few cautionary words on that. One is that, at least when I was in the region, it was very, very difficult, and this refers to the Central Asian countries as well, to get them to work together, to harmonize railroad regulations, customs, to work together. I would imagine that some of that has been ameliorated, but all I know is that the practical day-to-day problems of, putting this thing together are going to be very, very large, and I don't think we can, ignore them. Also, the idea that the new Silk Road, or One Road, whatever it's called, there's so many alternative forms of transport, available. The Trans-Siberian Railroad, a whole series of others, and I've read, certain economic analyses, which really call into question, sort of how much potential there is, for this sort of new Silk Road. I remember President Shevardnadze, when I was ambassador, was very, very positive on this, and it didn't, amount to much at that point. Chinese are obviously involved now, so I think that that's going to, improve the prospects, but nonetheless, it's still there. Another thing that I'd like to see some focus on, particularly with Georgia, is the North Caucasus, of Russia. I did not see any, description of issues there. When I was ambassador in Georgia, we almost had, a Russia-Georgia war in 1999 over the Pankisi Gorge and the war in Chechnya. I'm not predicting, that that's going to happen again, but if there is a downturn in relations, with Russia, it could be, over the North Caucasus, and it could perhaps lead to a resumption of the kinds of allegations that the Russians leveled against the Georgians 15 or 18 years ago. I totally agree with you on Nagorno-Karabakh. To me, that is, the biggest immediate security danger there. But perhaps reflecting on the hat that I now wear at Georgetown on conflict resolution, I think we need to go a little bit deeper. It's going to have to be more than the U.S. stepping in diplomatically. Maybe there's a role for, a Richard Holbrooke type, to force heads together, as in Dayton. But unless some steps are taken to change the narratives on both sides, to try to influence political leaders on both sides to prepare their publics, for a compromise, which is the only, the only way out. I'm not sure I see a light at the end of the tunnel. Ariel and I were talking on the way over here about the parallels between NK and Israel and Palestinians. Different narratives, generations of hostility, and it's going to take a lot more than, than negotiation, state to state or whatever, to get at the, the basic issues. I would also just like to raise the question that, I've always thought about, is the South Caucasus really a region, given all the differences, the major differences between the three countries? Geographically, clearly it is, they're contiguous, but they're so different, that it's very, very hard to, to say that. And that leads me to another point. And that is, I think there is room. We tried when I was there in the region to try to get the three Caucasus countries to work together. And what invariably happened was Armenia was positive, Georgia was positive, Azerbaijan said no to everything. They wouldn't do anything that redounded to the benefit of Armenia. Somehow or another, that dynamic, is going to have to change, if we're ever going to move forward in the area. And I would like to see Georgia take a much, enhanced role, a much higher level of diplomacy in the area. And, Georgia had elections just a couple of days ago, and the current government, the Georgia Dream, it won approximately 50% of the popular vote. This is a new mandate, mandate for economic reform, moving forward on the Western, trajectory in terms of foreign policy. But I would like to see, the Georgian government, use this to be a much more active, player, in the South Caucasus. Azerbaijan and Armenia, we can probably talk a little bit more, in the Q&A.
Thank you. Ambassador, you've raised some very important points, which I hope other speakers will touch on and our ensuing discussion will as well. So I'll turn it to Ariel to continue.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Jeff. I joined the ambassador. Sorry.
There you go.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Jeff. I joined the ambassador in congratulating CSIS with an excellent series of reports. At the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, where I had the Center for Energy, Natural Resources, and Geopolitics, we also created a report, surprise, in Washington, and we took a look at Georgia, the sort of track record of the last 4 years. And as you heard in the news, Georgia had yet another democratic and transparent parliamentary elections. The first time it was in 2012, resulting in transition of power from the United National Movement to the current Georgian Dream Coalition. And this time, international organizations such as OSCE, IRI, and others gave Georgia high marks for the elections. And our report actually explains to a great degree why these elections were transparent and why Georgia Dream got a resounding mandate. Georgia Dream, as you know, was launched by charismatic billionaire and philanthropist Bidzina Ivanishvili, who came with a mission to dislodge and replace President Mikhail Saakashvili, who, in my view, is a founder of the reform process that started in Georgia. But Georgia Dream, despite being a political opponent of Saakashvili, continued many of these economic and democratic reforms. And in fact, it balanced the apparatus of the state in such a way that people support that approach, a more balanced approach, a less revolutionary and more evolutionary approach. And that's one of the reasons Georgia Dream won the elections. So what were the challenges? The challenges included the social polarization. Georgia had higher GDP than, let's say, Armenia or Moldova, but on the per capita basis, the differences were bigger. The Gini coefficient was reflecting that. Unemployment rates were and still are very high. Healthcare was problematic. Education was problematic. Infrastructure is a big challenge. And all that against the background of a devastating war of 2008. So doing this package of reforms in a security situation where the country was defeated, where the country lost over 20% of its territory, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, to essentially de facto foreign occupation. So all these reforms were developed and continued since 2012. Vocational education, working on free trade area agreement with the European Union that would allow Georgian businesses to compete more successfully in Europe and facilitate foreign investment. At the same time, a less adamant position vis-à-vis Russia allowed Georgian goods and agricultural produce to be exported to Russia. We conclude, my author, Ivan Benovich, and myself conclude that while great accomplishments were achieved, the agenda for reform remains challenging and daunting. And we come up with a whole bunch of recommendations, and the report is available on our website, iags.org. The report is called Georgia Dream Meets Reality, Coalition First Term and Future Reform Prospect. And if you want, I have a little sheet that I can give you with the link. So what are the recommendations for the U.S. government? Why should we care? And we have one presidential candidate that says that we should throw away NATO or at least revise the relationship with NATO. That people who don't pay their way should not play, as if it was a security services company and not an alliance. Why should we care about Georgia that is so far away? Not Atlanta, Georgia, but the other Georgia. The answer is location, location, location. The geopolitical place of Georgia in both the north-south axis and east-west axis, proximity to Turkey, which is undergoing its own very daunting and challenging internal transformation, to what remains to be seen. Probably not in the direction of the United States and the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. Iran, that the administration let it out of its box, and of course Russia. So the Georgian people, whether voting for UND or for Georgia Dream, made it absolutely clear that their commitment to the Euro-Atlantic vector of development, aspiration to get into the EU and into NATO, remains staunch despite their political differences. This is the take-home we see from these elections. So our recommendation to the U.S. government for the next administration, whoever the president is, and probably one of the candidates will be more receptive to this recommendation than the candidate who wants to throw the toys and go home, are the following. Pursue a free trade agreement between U.S. and Georgia. The foundations for that and the talks about it were laid down, but the Obama administration focused on the big picture, on TTP and TTIP, with the results we are all aware of. Support more academic exchanges and legislative visits. One thing that makes a transition successful in the former communist country is the quality of policymakers and the depth of the bench. The countries that succeeded, such as the Baltic states, and to a great extent Georgia, had the depth of the bench, be it United National Movement or Georgia Dream. The countries have huge differences in Central Asia, or even in Ukraine, have a narrow bench. Ukraine had to import these decision makers from Lithuania, from Chicago, from other places, and very soon these policymakers were, excuse me, chewed up and spat out. So academic exchanges and training is extremely important. Promote visa liberalization with Western countries. We see how this is important for people to travel, for business, for tourism, for medical care, for what have you. This is a substantive thing that this relationship can give to regular folks in the countries that have pro-Western aspirations. Assist Georgia in reaching out to occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia should remain a magnet for these people. And we see with South Ossetia the train of merging South Ossetia with North Ossetia and then joining Russia has already been set in motion. So we may see next year a referendum in South Ossetia and South Ossetia leaving Georgia and joining North Ossetia in yet another violation and revision of post-Soviet borders. Further support of fight against corruption. Every poll that we examined tells us that corruption remains at the top of the priority list for Georgia. We recommend supporting English language education. Georgian language is ancient. The alphabet is one of the oldest. It has literature, it has poetry, it has songs. It's a language of culture, but ladies and gentlemen, it's not a language of international commerce. So for Georgia to develop economically, to attract investment, it has a wonderful labor force, educated, smart people. I travel to Georgia regularly, wonderful people, but they need this tool of lingua franca, of international language, to work with businesses, be it Western businesses or, for that matter, Chinese businesses. China, I'm going to talk about it, China pays a lot of attention to Georgia. And while the old Western Silk Road project may be not so successful, China has huge aspirations of the One Belt, One Road initiative, the OBOR, or Belt and Road Initiative. And Georgia is one of the westmost terminuses or terminals for the One Belt, One Road, in terms of ports, in terms of pipelines, in terms of airports, fiber optic cables, east-west moving Chinese goods into Europe. The estimate for 30-year investment for that project is 3 to 4 trillion with a T dollars. The allocation for the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank alone is over 100 billion. And I was in Beijing and said, well, you're inviting all these partners to the AIIB, so there'll be a collegial joint management of the bank. They looked at me and laughed and said, no, the management is going to be Chinese, quote, unquote. To wrap it up, we also recommend further investing in Georgian NGO and journalism training, supporting overseas private investment corporation to attract more U.S. Foreign direct investment because of high political risks, support an independent business dispute resolution system to lower the costs of litigation. But Georgia, overall, in my book, is a success story. It is not a Western country to the extent the Baltic states are the Western countries, but for millennia, it was the eastmost country of Eastern Christianity. It had been a part of a cultural space that goes all the way back to the Byzantine Empire. It always had connections not just to Eastern Black Sea and Mediterranean culture, but also to Western Europe. If you examine the memoir literature, if you look at the 3-year period of independence of Georgia after the 1917 Russian Revolution, you saw the tremendous influence of Western ideas, of the democratic form of government that was squashed and destroyed by the Soviet invasion in 1921, directed by Lenin and Stalin. So we have both an interest and a moral commitment to Georgia, and it's up to the next administration to execute that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel, for that forceful and useful take. I have to say, just before turning this to Andy, I would like to note that, Georgia's tremendous export of advisors over the last few years is also worth noting. Before we start thinking about sending more Americans to advise the Georgians, we might note just how many Georgians have been traveling around the world offering often very useful advice and taking on, indeed, government positions in some places because of their much more recent experience of successful reform, which I do sometimes wonder if it's time to stop teaching some of these folks and start learning from them. But I'm going to turn this over to Andy.
Thank you very much, Olga. And thank you very much to Olga and Jeff for inviting me to be on the panel today. Back here at CSIS, it's a real honor. And after working here for 8.5 years on a full-time basis, it always feels a bit like a homecoming to come back to CSIS. And particularly to be able to see some of the fruits of this very large and ambitious project that Jeff and I began to embark on 3 years ago, which we had Reconnecting Eurasia. I'll make a couple of comments about that in the end. I want to make my comments quite brief. I think Jeff has very well articulated some of the key recommendations and approach in the report and the project. And my brief comments are actually going to, even though this project, at least this part of the project, Eurasia from the Inside Out, was focusing on getting a very detailed, fine-grained picture of how, in this case, the three states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, in the so-called region of the South Caucasus, look at their interests in this very fluid and dynamic, Eurasian supercontinent. Last year, we published, 5 reports on the so-called states of the so-called region of Central Asia, also in this context. But I'm going to take a little bit different approach in that, as I've been kind of obsessed with the U.S.-Russia relationship for the last 4 or 5 months, in a project to write a report about U.S.-Russia relations with recommendations to the next administration. Whoever thought that was a good idea to accept that project? But I'm working hard on it and deeply steeped in it right now and revising it it's going to come out in very early December. But I want to talk about that, sort of put my comments about U.S. policy towards and with and relations with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia in the context of the U.S.-Russia relationship. Jeff kind of covered some of these points already, and as well as Ken, but as our Russian friends like to say, repetition is the mother of pedagogy, or повторение мать учения. Sounds a lot better in Russian. So the U.S.-Russia relationship, the West-Russia relationship, as you may have gathered recently, has not been going so well, to put it lightly. In fact, I think the U.S.-Russia relationship today is in a real crisis. I don't like to use the word crisis because I find it is overutilized, but I think we are in a crisis today, and a quite dangerous one. And whether it's a new Cold War or not a Cold War to some extent, that's an academic question, our increasingly hostile and adversarial posture towards each other is quite reminiscent in many ways of significant aspects of the Cold War. But I would argue that actually the current situation today may very well be more dangerous, at least than the latter decades of the Cold War, for a number of reasons, but I'll just mention one of them because it's relevant for our discussion today about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And that is, at least after the series of Berlin crisis and the building of the wall in 1961, the contestation over Berlin essentially was over. And there wasn't really a gray zone between East and West in the European security theater. Yugoslavia, okay. But I don't think that there was wasn't the kind of contestation between East and West over Yugoslavia. And as Ambassador John Herbst wrote in a chapter for a book that I also contributed to that came out recently, a big difference today is that there is a gray zone between East and West, so to speak. And these three countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, are in that gray zone. And there is contestation for power and influence between Russia and the West. And it has gotten obviously very dangerous. We've already had a war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, obviously, and then, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in the Donbass. So I think that's a point to keep in mind. Now, when Jeff and I embarked on our field work for research to these countries, which included the 5 Central Asian states and the 3 states in the South Caucasus. I return to your point toward the end, Ken. It's a very good one. We embarked upon these research trips. The first one was in April of 2014. So already the Ukraine crisis had started. And the research trips went through the year 2015. So, I think all 3 states that we're talking about today feel greater risk and vulnerability when U.S.-Russia relations are bad. I told you I was going to be pretty basic. All the states that we visited hoped first to see an improvement in the U.S.-Russia relationship, because in an improved U.S.-Russia relationship and a broader, more improved Russia-Western relationship would give each of the states to exercise a multi-vector foreign policy, which is at the core of all of the goals of the states of the South Caucasus and Central Asia as well. One needs to have having some kind of constructive relationship with Russia is absolutely essential, but one wants to balance and hedge with stronger relations with Europe, with the United States, with Iran, with Turkey, et cetera. And so they would be less beholden to the interests of one player against the other. And of course, the player they're most concerned about and nervous about is Russia. That's obvious. Now, it's interesting to contrast, I think, perspectives, and again, I'm going to overgeneralize here, in West Europe, East Europe, and the gray zone countries in this context. So I think West Europe, what Donald Rumsfeld kind of called the old Europe, feels less vulnerable to Russia and more inclined to seek accommodation with Moscow for economic and other reasons. And of course, part of the feeling less vulnerable is the protection felt in the context of the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, East Europe, those countries feel more vulnerable to Russia, but they feel also more protected because of their recent, relatively recent membership in NATO and EU. And so they will tend to call for a tougher stance from Washington as well as their European allies towards Russia, sort of broadly speaking. Now, the gray zone countries feel much more vulnerable, virtually no protection from the West, especially after seeing what happened in the August War of 2008, and more recently in Ukraine in 2014. And while all of the states that we visited, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, they all expressed the desire for stronger ties with Washington, and sometimes in kind of surprising ways to us. They are very acutely aware of the existential threat of pursuing these ties in the context of a deep crisis in the U.S.-Russia relationship. Now, I've not visited Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia for more than a year now, but I would have to think that the palpable sense of insecurity and vulnerability amongst all three states is all the greater. You know, in international relations theory, I think you can describe the U.S. and Russian relationship, and to a lesser extent, I think the Russia-Western relationship, we're in a security dilemma, which is actually a very significant feature of the Cold War relationship, in that measures that are taken by the United States or by Russia to increase their security are perceived as hostile and adversarial and threatening. In other words, the increase of security on one side is coming at the expense of the security of the other side. This phenomenon, the security dilemma, has become quite acute of late, very, very deep. I think it's exacerbated by a newer phenomenon of international relations theory called the status dilemma. I won't go into that for the sake of time. And so the skepticism, and I think the skepticism and hostility on the part of President Putin and some of those around him toward the United States has obviously deepened to a great extent. I mean, it's evolved. A great book, I think the best book actually of all of the various biographies and analyses of the Kremlin and Putin, et cetera, is All the Kremlin's Men by Mikhail Zygar. That just came out in English fairly recently. But he notes, Vladimir Putin started in 2000, 2001 with the desire to have strong relations with the West and the United States. And he thought that he could convince, them that was possible. Obviously, that was a long time ago. And the question I think that we face, and there are different views about this, is whether the skepticism and the hostility has reached a point where we can't pull it back. I still have some hope for that, but that's not really the point of this discussion. But I think we do not have a clear, policy toward Russia right now. I think there are contradictions in the approach to Russia. So coming up with a policy toward Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia is deeply complicated, by this tremendous hostility in the U.S.-Russia relationship. This is obvious. I told you it was going to be obvious, but I just think it needed to be said. Now, that doesn't mean that we should do nothing, but it means we have, I think as Jeff illustrated, I would emphasize, we can't have really any illusions, and we have to be very, very careful about thinking about how to exercise and increase whatever leverage we may have in helping to assist the countries of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia to strengthen their sovereignty and to strengthen their security. There's no easy answer to that. Okay, just a couple of comments to a few things that Ken raised, which I thought were very important. Silk Road. Absolutely, the hardest part about connectivity, and the Silk Road is really a network of transit connectivity, and not only transit connectivity, but telecommunications and otherwise. But the hardest part about that, it's a political problem, and Ken alluded to this. It's getting countries to cooperate with each other, and it's coming up with what myself and others have called the soft infrastructure of the Silk Road. The Chinese are focused on building more of the hard infrastructure. And one thing that Jeff and I recommended in our Central Asia report, maybe to a lesser extent, it was less highlighted in this report, is that, they think maybe there's sort of a division of labor. What the Europeans are good at, I think what the Americans are good at maybe is thinking about soft infrastructure, and there could be some kind of division of labor. Just a thought. Is the South Caucasus a region? Yeah, we did a project a few years ago that Jeff wrote a very good report on that kind of looked at it. Well, Sergei Markodonov had the term the Big Caucasus, rather awkward term in English, obviously. But it is, looking at the South Caucasus in the context of both the North Caucasus next door, as well as the key regional neighbors, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So completely agree with you on that point. And on the North Caucasus, I think there are indications of some increase in attacks and violent incidents there, but I think the danger would be increased tremendously if the jihadists who have gone from Russia from the North Caucasus, from other parts of Russia, from Central Asia, from the South Caucasus states, if they decide that they want to come back from Syria and Iraq or other theaters where the jihad is prioritized, then I think the dilemma that you talked about, Ken, could really reemerge in Georgia-Russia relations. And finally, where is Richard Holbrooke? Now, obviously, but one thing this really struck me, with the beginning of the Ukraine crisis in 2014, where I felt that our policy toward the crisis was one. There were sort of three baskets of policy. One of them was punish Russia, and that was getting the most attention and the most action. The most important part and the hardest part was to help Ukraine. Sometimes it's hard to help people if they're not really that keen on helping themselves. And thirdly, the other piece, of course, is why are we not investing more energy in the diplomacy of this? Where is Richard Holbrooke when we need him? Why are diplomacy is hard. I mean, Ken did it for a living, and I really feel that was a kind of a weak aspect of the Obama administration's approach to Ukraine. I think too much responsibility was devolved to our European allies, but that the United States and at the presidential level, needs to be engaged in this in a much deeper way. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for putting this into a broader perspective. I recognize the, I'm going to say, irony of introducing a report series that's focused on the region from the inside out, of looking at what folks in the region really have to say, and launching it with a panel composed entirely of Americans. So because of that, and to try to alleviate it slightly, what I'd like to do is, before we go to open Q&A, to ask if folks from the region, whether representing government or non-governmental interests, would like to briefly say something. So just if you have thoughts on what was said, if you have questions, I kind of want to make sure that you all get the first few words before we let the Americans and other representatives of great powers take over the conversation in their colonial manner once again. So, if I could ask if folks from the region have something to say, which we evidently do, the microphone is coming. Please do, for this and all questions and comments, please do begin by introducing yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mehmet Talibov. I'm a DCM of Embassy of Azerbaijan. Thank you for very much. It's very interesting. It's interesting also from point of view that we've been working together with Andy and Jeff, and I remember that we've been working on their visit to Azerbaijan. I think that this is not just important but very timely panel and timely attention that we have now to the region. Because I normally get a little bit surprised though I understand the reason there, but when we're talking about so-called region of South Caucasus. Why? Because first I think that South Caucasus region all the time, especially after the dissolution of Soviet Union, has shown the importance, and actually the dissolution of Soviet Union at some extent started from this region too, has shown its absolute importance on both on the greater region from Europe to the South Caucasus, and also with respect to the Central Asia and Afghanistan. after 9/11 happened, after the NATO coalition and all the other developments that happened in the region. South Caucasus always have shown itself as a core of all this in the region. When we're talking about the regional cooperation, Ambassador Yalovitz was speaking about that. Ambassador, actually, we have the regional cooperation. If you take if you have a glance back and have the possibility to think from where we started in 1992 or 1993, and have I think the only on post-Soviet region space, the only the true alliance between the three countries, which is Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, that is actually a success story. We have Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan there. I remember that myself even. I remember that it was called many times utopia before it became to. Yeah, really. I see many smiles. So I see people who are dealing with this definitely. So now we're talking about now that Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. Azerbaijan and Georgia actually the South Caucasus became having the physical connection to the Mediterranean region. Now we're talking about the Southern Gas Corridor. And again, coming to the point of, and we started to what's happened after 9/11 and all what was happened. We should remember that after the crisis in Ukraine, the issue of natural gas came also into the perspective of having new sources of gas in the region. And now we're talking about the possibility to connect, and it's already there, to connect the Southern Caucasus region all the way to Europe, all the way to Italy and other countries. So that works, and I think that especially after the war in 2008, and I think our Georgian friends would also confirm this. We were having when we had this economic crisis in Georgia, and the friendship and the cemented friendship and alliance between these three countries have helped a lot, and this has changed the reality in the region. And we, of course, this is a region, and I think that it has a great history. It's the region where Ariel, Mr. Cohen just was talking about the importance of Georgia in the region. Is definitely the case. It was the very progressive part of our region. But I also should underline here that the first democratic majority Muslim country is coming from this region too. That's also very important, especially which was Azerbaijan. So with giving the right to vote to women back in 1990. So this also brings a lot of interesting, the dynamics to the region. I think that this is definitely important, and especially after the escalation of the conflict in April this year in Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. We've seen a little bit more of activity from the co-chairs, especially U.S. and Secretary Kerry was deeply involved in this. But I think that we should definitely not think that it's the declining of the interest of the United States in the region, because it's there. It connects Europe and the Central Asia. It definitely works from many perspectives. On the Silk Road, for example, Ambassador Yalovitz just said that on the Silk Road it's still there. Actually, I tend to not agree, because we have a lot of development both in Georgia, in Turkey, and in Azerbaijan. Infrastructure is there. We just had a couple of months ago. We just had very successful conference here with our Georgian friends, with Turkey, Kazakhstan. Together, trying to actually show the companies that there is a possibility, there is a new channel to actually transport your goods all the way to Europe from China and vice versa. So that's and I think that on the conflicts in the region, we should have one standard to all. So when we're and I'm not going to go there, but when we're talking about, for example, Georgia, we unequivocally say about the occupation of the territories. When we talk about other conflicts, we don't. So if we will have these kind of differences all the time between talking about Kosovo, talking about Georgia, talking about Ukraine, talking about Azerbaijan, talking about Moldova, and have and apply a little bit slightly different standards, doing this ourselves, we're not gonna get there, because this is really important, and we really dream in Azerbaijan, and I'm sure that in all over the region, that one day Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, without resolution of all the conflicts, within their territorial borders, within their in peace. They will be living side by side, and I think that all three people of all three nations will strive, will be prosperous and live in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Before turning back to the panel, I would like to hear if others from perhaps Georgia and Armenia also have comments or thoughts. Okay, if not, I'm going to turn it to get a couple more broader questions before going back to the panel, just to kind of make the best use of time. So now feel free to speak, even if you're American. Fine. Or Russian, or French.
American in this case. Wayne Murray from the American Foreign Policy Council. I had the advantage of having seen all three of the reports when they were in preparation, so I won't comment on them. I want to react to two things that the panelists said. First, to agree very much with Ken Yalowitz, that for the United States, there has not been a time in the quarter century of independence of these countries when they have ranked so low in American foreign policy priorities. In part, I think this is a reflection of the fact that we're simply up to our eyeballs in problems elsewhere. But in part, I think it is also a reflection of great disappointment and frustration with domestic developments in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Not the same kind of developments, but parallel. And a feeling that if those two countries didn't have this tendency of being at daggers drawn, that we might not really pay much attention to them at all. I think the attitude toward Georgia is different, and particularly a sense of hope that Georgia is moving past what some have characterized as its previous tendency to messianic political leadership. That now you have a Georgia in which most members of Congress probably couldn't even name the prime minister. And that's probably a good thing because it means that the country is getting past this kind of messianic tendency. But the main point I'd like to make is to follow up on what Andy said. And I entirely agree with him that for the countries in the region, and for a lot of other countries in the world, when Moscow and Washington are really at such a period of miscommunication and even hazardous misperception, it makes their lives very difficult. But I think for the countries of the Caucasus, that is also very true for the deterioration in relations between Washington and Ankara. Now, this is something that has happened so fairly recently that it really couldn't be reflected in these reports. But this is a very, very important and worrisome development for all three of the countries in the Central Caucasus. And while I know that U.S.-Turkish relations have had bad patches before, I actually was a participant in a small way in the 1974 Cyprus crisis. I don't think that there's any time since the really significant establishment of U.S.-Turkish relations in the Truman administration when things have been this bad. And I don't think we've hit bottom yet. And I think that in many respects, everything that Andy said about the American-Russian relationship and its implications for the region applies equally well, and perhaps even more importantly, for the deteriorating American-Turkish relationship. So that's just a note of caution I think I would introduce into the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Do we have, I think from here on I'm going to ask that we focus on questions, things that you might think the panelists might want to respond to. But do we have other comments at this moment? No? Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to what we've heard so far, both from one another and from the folks in the audience. And again, let's just go down the line. Jeff?
Okay, thank you. I guess this is the danger of doing a panel in the mid-afternoon. Everybody's got the post-lunch hangover. Okay, there were a lot of things that were said by the other panelists and by the questioners that are provocative and worth discussing. I'm going to just focus on a couple in the interest of time. On this question of is the South Caucasus a region, right? Well, certainly there's regional cooperation or multilateral cooperation among some of the countries in the South Caucasus, but not all of them. And between some of the countries in the South Caucasus and some of the outside powers, but not all of them. So at best, it's a bifurcated region. And I would argue that there's not a sense of shared regional identity or a belief that there's a shared regional destiny, which to my mind would be the defining characteristic of whether this is a region or not. There's integration among some of the countries in the region, but not all of them. On the question of U.S. interests, it's a very weird moment in the United States and in recent United States history. I think you could argue that there's declining U.S. interest in just about every part of the world right now, even parts that are more central to American security and prosperity than the South Caucasus. Nonetheless, I think Wayne's point about disappointment with developments in countries of the South Caucasus is right, as well as the difficulties in U.S. relations with the surrounding countries. Not only are U.S. relations with Russia and Turkey in flux, so too are U.S. relations with Iran and the European Union in different ways. Given the number of items on the agenda in the bilateral relationship with each of these countries, the South Caucasus is one item in a very long list. And it's not, I would argue, the most important issue in any of those bilateral relationships. And so in some ways, the U.S. focus, to the extent that there is a focus, is on these other things. Turkey. Wayne, I'm glad you mentioned Turkey, because Turkey is not only at a moment of very bad relations with the United States, but Turkey's overall geopolitical role seems to be in flux. Despite the fact that it remains a member of NATO, and despite the fact that it still hosts U.S. military forces on its soil, there is, I think, a sense, exacerbated since the coup in July, that Turkey is carving out a separate vector for itself, a separate identity that has implications for its relationship with the United States, but also for its relationship with Russia. And when you have these large boulders shifting around, it's the smaller rocks in the middle, in some ways, the South Caucasus, that get caught in between. And so while, as I said at the beginning, the purpose of this project was to try and show the agency of the states in the region, or in the so-called region, I think the fact is that right now, because so much is shifting in terms of the relationships among the major powers surrounding the region, it's both a danger and an opportunity for the countries of the South Caucasus. It's a danger, obviously, because the risks of confrontation are quite high, and there was the standoff between Russia and Turkey following the downing of the aircraft last year. But at the same time, in this shifting environment, there are more opportunities to play this multi-vector game that, I think it was Andy mentioned, all of the countries of the South Caucasus ultimately want to do. So the dangers of getting it wrong are significant, but at the same time, there are opportunities there. And Turkey is increasingly becoming a wild card for all three countries.
Thanks, Jeff. I will, before going back to the panel, take the moderator's prerogative to interrupt with my own thoughts and say that when I think about what makes something a region or not, what makes a group of states a region, there's geography, right? There's integration. There's also conflict, right? I mean, conflict. The question. I think the question of whether it's a region or not is, does it make sense to look at things, whether they're positive or negative, from the standpoint of all of the countries involved. And on those terms, I don't think there's any question that the South Caucasus qualifies as a region. Okay, so I'm done with my interruption, and I'm going to go to Ambassador Galevitz.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all the fellow panelists. It's been very, very interesting. There are a few things I wanted to ask Andy.
You mean Jeff?
No, Andy. No, Andy, because you talked a lot about, and Wayne did as well, about Turkey, Russia. That's a very interesting relationship, and I'm wondering sort of how we see this playing out. In other words, how deep is this relationship going to be? They still have major differences over Syria. And, you know, the two countries have obviously have, you know, differing national interests, and I think, you know, those are going to come, you know, into play here. They've made the gas, you know, the Turkish Stream, you know, a centerpiece. That, you know, collapsed, you know, a few years ago. I don't know all that much about the energy, but there are a number of competitive, you know, gas pipelines in that region. And when I think in terms of the hullabaloo about Russia-China gas pipelines, and I think a lot of that is proving, you know, very over, you know, exaggerated. I guess I'm just asking, you know, are there sort of limits, you know, to this Turkish-Russian, you know, rapprochement? And the same way, we haven't really said much about China-Russia, you know, in terms of any competition of theirs, certainly in Central Asia, but also, you know, in the Caucasus. I think there's something, you know, that's another area that's worth looking at. And another area we haven't looked at all is the relationship between the European Union and the EEU, you know, in this part of the world. You've got Armenia going one way, Georgia going another way, and Azerbaijan, you know, sort of determinedly taking an independent role. But as I said, that's another sort of overall regional dimension that we need to look at. But the thing that I really wanted to mention, though, is I'm very concerned about this question of weapons supplies, you know, in Nagorno-Karabakh. The recent $200 million, you know, loan, whatever it was, to Armenia, the introduction of these new missiles, very, very dangerous, you know, development to me. And I'm wondering, you know, whether or not, you know, I'd love to hear from, you know, everyone else here, whether or not there's room for any kind of an initiative, and perhaps from Georgia or elsewhere, about limitations on arms supplies, you know, to the two warring sides. Obviously, it's going to go right at Russia, but I'm wondering if there's anything that, you know, that could be done in that area.
Thank you. That's great and really important points raised. Ariel.
I was jotting down a whole bunch of issues that were raised here, and I was looking for an organizing principle or underlying principle. And it's challenging, but I would say we, the U.S., need to decide a holistic concept of how we want our foreign policy to be in the next administration. We, for 2 decades, kept talking about Russia being at a crossroads. I think this is time we start talking about U.S. being at a crossroads. I think that what Trump articulated in a sometimes crude way, very crude way, is a sentiment that after 2 wars, we need to take a look at our global commitments and what can we afford and what we cannot afford, and where are the priorities. President Obama was talking about pivot to Asia, but I did not see a commitment of resources necessary to project power into the Pacific, where the distances are twice as long as over the Atlantic, and where the economic, industrial base and the very old political culture of China potentially, I'm not saying we're there, but potentially can create a protracted confrontation that will dwarf the Cold War. At the same time, President Obama was making noises of disengagement and pulling out of the Middle East, and that directly affects our South Caucasus engagement. But that discussion did not happen. I do not hear. Who asked where's Richard Holbrooke? You asked, right? But not only on the level of diplomacy, but on the level of high policy, that discussion is not happening. Occasionally, Henry Kissinger writes something, Richard Haas writes something, but it didn't congeal yet. Are we going to look at South Caucasus from that, not 30,000 feet, but 60,000 feet vantage point? Or we're going to look transactionally at this pipeline and this piece of real estate and look at future potential conflicts vis-a-vis, be it Iran. By the way, somebody said, oh, we resolved the conflict with Iran. I don't believe it for a second. That thing can blow up sky high so fast we won't recognize what hit us. If Andrew is right, and I think he is, that we're facing a dwindling spiral of the relationship with Russia that is potentially as dangerous as, or maybe more dangerous than, the previous iteration of a Cold War, South Caucasus is a vital piece of real estate. We hoped in the перезагрузка, reset, to farm out regional issues of the former Soviet Union to Russia as a responsible actor, even past Georgia War. And I see Colonel Hamilton, with whom I had the privilege of co-authoring a War College monograph about the Georgia War. We hoped that Russia will be a responsible regional actor. I think the Obama administration was deeply disappointed. And then there's EU and Turkey, and I think they both are so busy with internal and external challenges that we cannot hope that either Turkey or EU, together or separately, will replace us as a external actor in South Caucasus. So I'm raising more questions than I have answers. I think this is a very important agenda for the next administration, and I hope and pray that we will have caliber of people, starting with the president, you're laughing here, who have the depth of historic knowledge, which is absolutely vital, the depth of geographic knowledge, who doesn't say, Russia? I don't know anything about Russia, quote, unquote, from 2 days ago, who understand that we're dealing with Russia and China, who are both nuclear powers, who have proxies who are nuclear powers, like North Korea. We are in a perilous era, as the Chinese curse go, let you live in interesting times. These are very interesting times. And in that big picture, South Caucasus is and will remain an important north-south and east-west intersection, a place of meeting of multiple cultures, of Eastern Christianity, of Shia Islam, of Western influences, of Russian influences, of railroads and roads and fiber optic cables and oil and gas pipelines. And I do not see how the United States, if we are worth our medal as a global power, how can you just pick up and pack and go home? We are not the British Empire. I hope we're not a British Empire after World War II. I hope we're not that exhausted and not as much in debt. And I hope I'm right. Thank you.
Andy, you want to pull all of that together?
I don't think we're as exhausted, but I think we might be in much greater debt.
Much greater what?
Much greater debt. Let me just try to quickly cover a few points that came out in the discussion. One thing just about the project, because there is another component to it in which actually there is product, that is the so-called Eurasia outside in, and that we commissioned 6 reports on the great larger powers in Eurasia: China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, India, as well as Europe, to kind of give that larger picture. When Jeff and I initially visualized the project several years ago, the third component would be an effort to try to put the whole mosaic together. But I defected to Georgetown, and that task remains on the table. I think I will actually put together a course on this for Georgetown, because that forces one to
it
think,
together.
to read and think and kind of clarify your thoughts, and maybe something will come together from that. At one point in all of our meetings in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, there was tremendous hope on their part for reaching an agreement on the Iran nuclear program, so that would soften the conflict between the United States and Iran, and to a lesser extent Europe and Iran, and that did happen. Russia, Turkey. I think there are competing and collaborative instincts in both countries. Clearly, hundreds of years of history suggest that the competitive instincts are stronger than the collaborative instincts, and that the 15-year periods of the rapprochement engineered under the leadership of Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin is kind of exceptional in the longer trajectory of the bilateral relationship. But I think one thing that does kind of drive them together now, despite from November 15th and the shoot down of the Russian plane until July and the coup, or attempted coup in Ankara, is that both Russia and Turkey feel that they are somewhat alienated from and shunned by Europe as well as the United States, and that I think kind of pushes them closer together. But especially in the South Caucasus, I think there are many competing instincts. On EU and the EEU, the one problem about this is that they're fundamentally different projects, or at least especially what the EU is proposing, to its eastern neighbors, which is basically expansion are free trade agreements, and the European Union is a customs union. So these are fundamentally kind of contradictory projects that are difficult to put together, but nevertheless, somehow, Europe. The countries in the gray zone and Russia, they have to, for the sake of the prosperity and sovereignty of the countries in the gray zone, they have to work out a more effective modus operandi. I mean, remember that the conflict over Ukraine started over this basically trade differences. A quick the pivot to Asia. Well, yeah, one problem for the pivot of Asia is that some other realities intervened. The war in Ukraine, which I think was sort of symbolized sort of reopening of the European security theater. And it takes a lot of time of policymakers and resources as well to address that. And then, of course, what's been happening in Syria and Iraq. I think the rise of ISIS in a relatively short period of time has also kind of sapped attention from our policy cadres, as well as the resources that we can devote to them. One thing I think to think about, and I do believe in free trade, and I wouldn't give up at this point on the TPP or TTIP, but I think that for the TTIP, if it is that should be a tool that we would try to engage the countries of the South Caucasus as well, for sure. Actually, just like I think that for whether it's TTIP or TPP. That we should, try to engage Russia. I mean, it's going to be very problematic for Russia if these two regional trade institutions come together and Russia is left out. I mean, there's already a challenge, I think, of Russia being left out in many global supply chains that are going to be rather pernicious over time for Russia's economic growth. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I think that actually is going to be our closing thoughts for this session. I would like to thank all of our panelists. I would particularly like to thank Andy and Jeff, though, for giving us this series of reports, for making this project happen. I do encourage those of you who haven't already grabbed copies to take them on your way out. But I thought we had a really excellent panel of which raised and in some cases answered some very important questions, and I'd also like to thank the audience for taking part. So thanks again, and do grab a report on the way out, or three, yeah.